So thank you all for coming to this evening's Way Seeking Mind talk. It's nice to see your faces. Um, I think not everyone here knows me. My name is Angu Devin Ashwood. Angu Daichi was the name given to me in a jukai, a late ordination ceremony in 2004. Angu Daichi means serene bull, great wisdom. Fortunately, not as has been suggested, serene wisdom, great bull. So I appreciated the way around it was put. And the bull, being a bull, I've had an interest in the symbology of the bull or the ox in my Zen career. As you may be aware, for example, that there's 10 ox herding pictures associated with the Zen path, and they're normally associated, I think, more with the Rinzai tradition, but I've been somewhat interested in them. I have a fantasy of having a serene bull tattoo at some point. So I've taken some interest in the symbology of them, and the bull, I think, in these images can symbolise the ultimate nature of reality, or maybe more mundanely as the way. So if this is a way-seeking mind talk, maybe the relevance of this journey that the boy goes on as he's in search of the bull may be relevant to me. So just in summary, these ox herding pictures, depict a boy initially looking for a bull, and in the second image he discovers the footprints, then he perceives the bull, catches the bull, tames the bull, rides the bull home, and eventually transcends the bull, then transcends himself as well, before returning to the source and ultimately coming back to the marketplace with maybe wish-fulfilling gems. And so this is a kind of linear path. It's presented as a set of linear images. So I've been thinking about my story in relationship to a sort of linear path, but I also think that's quite it's a symbolic path. I think all of the elements of that path in my life have been available at any moment, but some qualities have been very present at different times. So there's been certain aspects of my life where I've really felt like I'm kind of looking and I'm not finding, and there's been parts of my life where it's seemed like I'm kind of on a path, and sometimes it's even seemed like I'm just sitting on this bull riding it home. But I'm not trying to claim any particular attainment by referring to these images. They're just really symbolic of my story at different places. And as I said, this is a way-seeking mind talk, and I looked up where this phrase "way-seeking mind talk" comes from, and I found out in Japanese it's doshin do, which they translate literally as being aware of or turning towards the Tao. The Tao, as in like the Taoism, like the way. And the Tao, rather like the bull, gets translated both as the absolute principle of the universe and the way, rather like the Dharma is the teaching of the Buddha and phenomena, and maybe you could say reality. So in thinking about my path to this point, what are the causes and conditions that have led me to this point, to the way, to this place that's unfolding now? I really don't know. I have a story. In one sense, I feel like pulling this talk together has been a process of elaborating a confession of the fragmentary threads I'm holding my self-story together with. What are the punctuation points in my life that give me a story? I think it was maybe 2002. I went on a retreat with Reb Anderson, and he gave a number of talks with the theme of the self as story. And I'll come back to that later. So I've been sort of quietly exploring the reaches of these causes and conditions in pulling this together as somewhat of a confessional practice. And these threads fire off in multiple directions, and maybe somewhat beginningless and endless in some sense, but of course I have a story that I think of that can appear in consciousness about where this started. And I think that this story began in this lifetime with some of my earliest memories, which were oriented around death. So I had from a very young age, as young as I can remember, I had a very clear idea about my own extinction, by my own death. That at some point, no matter how much I did, or who I loved, or how much I was loved, or whatever happened in my life, it would all come to nothing as far as I was concerned. And some of my earliest memories are lying awake in bed at night, being terrified of that non-existence, of that whatever my life amounted to. Ultimately, it would amount to nothing as far as I was concerned. And so the big questions, the great problem of life and death, as Katagiri put it, were very present for me growing up. What is this life? What is there an afterlife? What is the reality? And I kind of wanted to know that when I died, I wanted to be ready for that, because it was terrifying, and I didn't feel ready as a child. But I don't think that was the start of the story. Now, looking back, I think that the story started in previous lives. I think that karmic habits of mind and body are conditioned before this birth. I recently read a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, who cited some authors who did a scientific research study where they conditioned mice to be terrified of a particular smell, and then brought up their children in isolation from them. And their children, although they were fostered, were also terrified of their smell, and their children's children were also terrified of the same smell. So somehow trauma was getting passed on. This terror was getting passed on lifetime to lifetime through the genes. And if I look at the conditions of my parents, and I think maybe one of the reasons my unusual preoccupation with death as a very young child, I think maybe that was set in motion before I was born. My father's father died when he was 12, and while I was and before I was born, I think while my mother was pregnant with me, maybe my older brother Julian died in his cot, and because of that, my mother couldn't hold me as a child when I was born in 1972. She, would have been diagnosed with postnatal depression if she'd been to a doctor. So not being held, and I think my mother probably feared that I was going to die as well. I think that was part of her process of not being able to bond with me. And I think somehow that's probably affected me as well. So I was set out in life searching. This is for me like the first ox herding picture of the boy looking for something. Now my parents were from fairly working class backgrounds, but they were very influenced by the hippie movement of the 1960s, and were inspired to move into a sort of a small holding in the East Midlands for two reasons. One is to pursue attempt at self-sufficiency, and the other was to escape life that was very dominated by drugs. So my parents were in recovery from drug addiction when I was before I was born, and this move to try and set up a new life for themselves involved my mother taking us to church, trying to integrate us into the community. And so I was presented by ideas of God, but that was kind of conflicted because my dad was clearly an atheist. But I really wanted to believe in something. I really wanted death not to be the end at that age. And although I was recruited as an altar boy and I enjoyed the ceremony and there was something about that and the kind vicar which inspired me, I couldn't believe. I wanted to, but I saw no sign or no. It wasn't in my bones. I didn't believe the childish stories I was being told about God and Jesus at that time. And I was kind of unhappy at school. And throughout my schooling, actually, I particularly in my primary schooling and early secondary schooling, I thought of suicide quite a lot. I had this idea that it was all going to end in nothing anyway. Why would I carry on going through this suffering if it all ended in the same place? Why wouldn't I end it sooner and avoid all that suffering? Yeah, and I, when I think why have I come to practice, a memory comes of somebody asking Reb, why can't I motivate myself to practice? And him saying, well, maybe you haven't suffered enough yet. So maybe suffering has been one of my pathways into practice. But alongside a lot of the suffering, I was also given some pointers around maybe where the bull might be found. And I have my parents to thank for their ideas and views and commitment to ideas of love and peace. I remember one memory of my father talking really admirably about people putting flowers into the end of soldiers' rifles in the 1960s. And I was really touched by his by how he was touched by that. Yeah. So one of the ways I think I dealt with my difficulty was in fantasy. I was really and whilst I tried to escape into fantasy, the kind of fantasy I was drawn into was often very Buddhist or Taoist influenced. So I particularly was inspired by, for example, like Luke Skywalker and Yoda in Empire Strikes Back, or Caine and Master Po in Kung Fu, or Monkey and Tripitaka. These master-disciple relationships that were on a spiritual journey really spoke to me in that. And I feel like that was maybe offering some of these first footprints of the ox. Maybe that was giving me a hint of where the path might be. In later life, I trained in Tai Chi Do and later still in karate and Aikido and Tai Chi, and as part of that, seeking this student-disciple relationship. But how this evolved into a bodhisattva vow life is different to the how to get out of suffering. And when I thought about where the roots of that were, there's a memory which I have, maybe I was 13 or 14, maybe 12, I don't know, maybe 14, of this darkness that was in me, this kind of, maybe depression, coming to the point, and this contemplation of suicide, coming to the point where I really didn't want to, didn't see any point of going on, and I remember sitting in my living room, looking down at my dog, who was this really sweet Jack Russell, looking into her adoring eyes, and thinking, well, I'm going to die, and it'll all amount to nothing. So there's no point me living. Life and death really makes no difference, actually. But looking at my dog, I felt like, well, maybe I could live for these creatures that don't realise they're going to all come to nothing. Maybe I could give my life to that, and it was it's a sort of warped kind of bodhisattva vow in a way, but there was something about an idea of living for others that came to me at that age, which I've remembered since then. And also since then, I hadn't really thought about suicide in that same way. I don't remember having suicidal thoughts after that thought, even though I've been very unsuccessful at living solely for others. That's been not a strong practice consistently. And so anyway, these questions still, this big question of life and death was still there, and I explored many paths in my teens. I got interested in the occult. I tried meditation after reading books about it, and experimented with drugs, particularly psychedelic drugs, and experienced some, what seemed like very profound shifts in consciousness. I was open to perceiving reality in a way that I couldn't have imagined was, yeah. So that, and it opened me to the reality that the way I saw things wasn't the only way to see things. Also, in my later teens, I met vegetarians and became a vegetarian, and met my first serious partner, Diane, who introduced me to feminist ideas, and my feeling of okayness in the world started to get propped up by ideas. I took refuge in ideas, becoming. I'm a vegetarian. I'm a socialist. I'm a feminist. But these ideas still didn't address the question of life and death. And in my early 20s, I met the Hare Krishna movement. I felt drawn to it because of my being a vegetarian, and met monks for the first time, people who had devoted their lives to living in a way that understood this question, that lived in accordance with this question. And I quickly developed an idea that that's how I wanted to live. I wanted my life devoted to understanding who I was, understanding reality, understanding this big question of life and death. And also I kind of started to understand that there needed to be a container for practice. There needed to be some form, some path. And as I went through university and got politically active and further developed my refuge in views, I ended up working at Amnesty International and developing some good friends, which included somebody who introduced me to my first retreat, my first Zen retreat. And whilst I was using psychedelics partly as a distraction and partly to push the envelope and try and understand my own mind, I also began to realise how limited they were and how unsustainable that was and how kind of messy that was, how messy that made my life. And also that I didn't really feel there were any real truths coming from it. It disavowed me of the view that there's only one way of looking at the world. But apart from that, I lost faith in drugs and got more interested in sustainable consciousness exploration. So I started eating nothing but raw food. I gave up drugs and developed righteous views about that. So I was getting more and more into fundamentalism and ecology. But then through going to Glastonbury Festival, which I had started going to in a fairly hedonistic way, but in later on going to to support political causes there, I went to the FWBO tent, the Western Buddhist Order tent in the healing field, and was taught metta bhavana and mindfulness of breathing by one of the teachers there, and that was my first formal kind of training from a human being, from a teacher. And it felt like in 1999, when I started meditating on a daily basis, I really started to embed in a path. And because I was asking myself the question, what do I really want to get right in this life? What do I want to develop in this life? Do I want to become a carpenter or a musician or develop my career? What's really important? And I realized that wherever I went, this mind would be there, and meditation seemed to be the technology for developing the mind. So I decided I was going to meditate, and in 1999 I decided I'm going to meditate every day, and I've been relatively successful. That commitment has mostly carried through, apart from a few periods where children have been born. But I still hadn't found my path, apart from that I knew meditation was part of it. And I went to see various gurus and avatars like John de Ruyter and Amma, Eckhart Tolle, and they say when the student's ready, the teacher will appear. And and there was that around that time, around my Saturn return, when Saturn came back into the same position I was born. They say Saturn's associated with truth. Well, this was really a crux, a turning point in my life. I was really seeking deeply around this time. And as I say, this friend I met at Amnesty International, who went on retreats, which I was really intrigued by because I was already meditating by that point, suggested he maybe I could come on this retreat, and I did. And I went to Gaia House in 2000 and met Reb. And the same year, I moved into a house in Glastonbury with a member of the Western Buddhist order called Dharma Bandhu, and practiced with the Sangha there. And started to meet good people who maybe weren't backing up their own and each other's views with more fundamentalist views. And I met people who were willing to challenge me about my fundamentalism, and so that kind of started to loosen. And it was there that I met Amanda, who was the mother of my first child. And we met at a Bhakti yoga evening of a mutual friend doing Kali mantra, and I was chanting for Kali to help me cut off my egoistic self, and later regretted that, or not. But anyway, Amanda, who I met at that evening, had some of the wonderful qualities of Kali, who I share a child with, and I left that relationship some years later much more humble. But we went on some spiritual adventures in Bhakti and Wicca and various traditions together along the way, and she ended up coming on retreat with me as well, so it was nice that she met Reb. But where the turning point came in going to refuge in views and going for refuge in the Dharma, I think, was in that first retreat with Reb. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but my response was, "So I have to give up all my views?" And he said, "Well, all of them," because I had so many views and I was right about everything. And when he said, I just trusted him. I don't know why, but for some reason, meeting Reb, I was willing to give up all my views and follow this path to give up views, and I've been trying to follow that ever since. And I've been going to retreats with Reb whenever he's come to England ever since. And the next year, when I came back to him, was another shift in my practice. And again, I can't remember exactly what he said, but my response was I asked some question about the nature of reality, and he said something, and my response was, "So this is it?" And he smiled, and it was like the room just turned to light, and it awakened a real powerful wish in me to study and practice and teach Dharma. Maybe this was perceiving the way for the first time. Maybe this was kind of seeing the bull and knowing the direction I needed to go. It was just such a great relief. Up until that point, my practice had been around developing myself, overcoming suffering, forging ahead, growing a self, and to just, this is it. There's nothing more. Something clicked then. It was such a relief to me. And the year after, I asked to receive precepts from Reb on the retreat, which had a theme around renunciation. You probably heard Shizuki Roshi saying that to give your bull a large, spacious meadow is the way to control him. And I don't think that means sending him off into the wilds. I mean that giving him a container, a spacious one. And it feels like that's what Zen has been for me. A spacious, wide open meadow. And in that same year, Gaia was born, my first child was born. Shortly after a retreat, which her Gaia's mum came on with me, and on that retreat, as a sort of afterthought, Amanda and I asked Reb if he would marry us. I think, was anybody at that wedding? Maybe you were, none of you were. I think Reb lent Amanda his Chinese robe, and Breck, who some of you may know, lent me his robe, and we got married in these robes. And I remember somebody saying to me, "Oh, you look great in that robe. You should ordain as a priest." and and oh, that touched me. That really tapped into this wish that the Hare Krishnas had awakened in me, and it's never really gone away. That I would really like my life and being to embody practice. And yeah, there's something about it being really explicit in ordination that's been very attractive to me ever since. And finding containers for practice, whether that's marriage, whether it's doing courses, whether it's considering priest ordination, has been a theme in my life ever since. Really finding, how do I support and be supported in practice, and not being afraid of commitments has been had a strong effect in that. Saying yes to one thing, saying no to another. I didn't run away from my responsibilities, I think, of being a father, despite going to Green Gulch and enjoying it very much some years later. But I think also the idea of practice as a selfless endeavour was growing at this time. And I knew that I wanted to support people in their practice and be supported in my practice. I knew I wanted to study, practice and teach Dharma. I wanted my life to be oriented this way. And somebody said to me, "Oh, Western Dharma teachers, they train as therapists." I don't know quite where they got that idea, but I'd also received some. Amanda and I, my oldest daughter's mother, and I were in therapy together to try and support our relationship. And I was quite inspired by that therapist. And so I started training as a counsellor and psychotherapist in 2002. In 2004, I received ordination in a ceremony with Reb. And part of that ceremony is to say, it was said to me, you have returned to your original nature, free from attachments and limited ways. So the ceremony, in some ways, it's like you're being told you're Buddha. Now how are you going to deal with that? That's how it came across to me. It felt like the whole past summarised in that ceremony in some ways. But despite that, I felt like this is where I could begin to really tame the bull, to ride the bull home. There's a significant amount of karma to extinguish. Sorry, Claire and Chris. Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I think the intoxication of arrogance and views that started to take over from the intoxication of drugs started to get eased from this point on, or maybe up to this point. But there was a process that, particularly around the painful separation with my eldest daughter's mother, really started to help me to humble, as I mentioned earlier. And after we separated, when Guy was just 2, I moved into a community called Shekin Ashram, and that's where I met Nikki, my current wife. Up to that point, all the intimate relationships I had been characterised by consistent conflicts, like daily arguments. And they say, when the student's ready, the teacher will appear. Well, I must have been ready, because when I met Nikki, she taught me how to not fight. It was a revelation to me. I thought I was doomed to conflict-ridden relationships my whole life. And she taught me you could just walk away, that actually trying to sort stuff out while you're upset isn't a good idea. And I feel very grateful for her teaching me peace. We got married a couple of years later. And I think the year we married, I started working as a drugs counsellor in a addiction treatment service, a residential addiction treatment service, or rehab. And the rehab had in many ways, it had qualities a bit like a monastery. That there was being of service, there was training, there was practice, there were people living together on a path, and in some ways, that my role, had a sort of secular priest-like qualities. It was serving a community of people who were looking for pastoral care, and it was also very stressful, probably a lot more stressful than your average monastery. Somebody once asked me how stressful it was. I said, well, I suspect armed conflict's probably more stressful. There was a lot less meditation going on in the addiction treatment centre than probably most monasteries. And that was the year I went to Green Gulch for the first time. And Reb helped me to be clear about my responsibilities, much as I would have loved to have stayed. And also that year I applied for a job as a director at Gaia House, because it came up in my email, and I thought, God, that would be great to just have my full-time job devoted to a Dharma centre. But they didn't offer me the job. But it planted a seed that I'd like to be spending all my days devoted to Dharma. And as part of that, I responded to an invitation from an organisation called Angulimala for people to work in prisons as Buddhist chaplains, as another container to support and be supported in practice. I remember writing to Reb, asking him for a reference, because one of the requirements was that you had the support of your teacher. And in the back of my mind was, I'm going to get a nice letter from Reb saying that I know the Dharma. He was so clever, though. He said to me, well, why don't you write the reference and I'll just tell you if I agree with it. So here was me having to now write a very humble reference, Buddhist appropriate reference for myself. And I wondered, was I ready? I wanted Reb's approval. I didn't know. That was part of me wanting him to write nice things about me. It was like I wanted some approval, and I still don't know if I'm ready. But I've been doing it 10 years now. And Tara was born around this time. Tara was the only child of mine that I didn't. My personal practice didn't go to hell for a few months afterwards. So thank you, Tara. Both Guy before that and the twins afterwards, my daily practice was not as consistent. And then, I'd moved on from here, from just practicing therapy to also training other therapists. So I was working for the Centre for Addiction Treatment Studies, training addiction therapists. And I really wanted to make my life more congruent in terms of my personal practice and what I was doing in therapy. And I was fortunate that Action on Addiction were willing to support me, both financially and in terms of giving me time to study for a master's degree in mindfulness-based approaches. So for the 5 years between 2008 and 2016, I was on this training pathway, this part-time training pathway, so that I could develop something we'd started at Action on Addiction, which was teaching mindfulness as a relapse prevention strategy. And I started working with a trainer in the US called Sarah Bowen, who developed the mindfulness-based relapse prevention model. And we started offering that in the centre that I worked at, and I started teaching that as part of the addiction counselling training at one point later. And the two aspects of addiction training that I was most passionate about were teaching mindfulness, and also I apprenticed and eventually practiced and eventually taught interpersonal group psychotherapy as well, which is helping people to give and receive feedback from each other. And that feels very congruent with Reb's teachings in community, that somehow reveals interdependence in relationship. And so in this period, for 2008 2016, as I'm doing this mindfulness master's degree, my twins are born, Meta and Soren. As I say, my practice got a bit patchy there for a while. And I was deeply embedded in these two things, this training course and my home life. And still really deeply wishing for this way to realise practice moment by moment in my life, and still kind of yearning for a hermit's life, yearning to live in the monastery. I wrote a poem, a fairly simple poem. I don't think my poems are that great, but I feel like this poem, I look back at it and it kind of summarises some of what was going on for me at that time. It's called Staying Home. Staying home, not going anywhere, in the temple. Precepts of compassion for walls and a heart of fire for devotion. Children's cries call me to practice. Laundry and dishes offer themselves to me day by day. My lovers of past and present, my dear friends and teachers. I sit in the hall, my Sangha surrounds. It seems I could leave at any moment, but the cries of the world whisper again and again, stay home. Later in that year, I think it was 2012, I sat the Rahatsu retreat at Untstone Grange with Ingen, and this was, I think, another turning point in my life, because, well, I couldn't say I experienced a dropping away of self on that retreat, because I couldn't say it exactly happened to me, but I do remember afterwards tears for my limited life that I'd been living to that point. I remember that coming back from something. And although I think I felt like I'd had glimpses before, maybe this was, my first real opening to something bigger. Maybe the bull, the self being transcended somehow. And I think this was a turning point in the koan of self-death for me. I think death was a very personal thing up until that point, and somehow that rocked that self-clinging idea around death. I think it had been being eroded, but there was an experience on that retreat which things weren't so personal anymore. Death wasn't quite such a personal thing. And in the following years, as I was completing my Masters in Mindfulness, I started to explore priest training with Reb and then Ingen, and then Reb again, to see if there was some way of following that path outside of a monastic environment. And there was something about, and as I dipped my toe into that world and started tentatively training with Ingen and Rebecca and Bev, there was something there which was just very right. Also went back to Green Gulch that year. Went back to Green Gulch, and the second time I went to Green Gulch, I realised how much the first time had been like a fairground. I was just dazzled by the lights and the magic. The second time it felt much more kind of like I was embedded in the practice. And it was that year, I think maybe was it just before or just after, but this job at Gaia House came up again as a director, and I applied again 10 years later than the first time, and this time they gave me the job. And that was another turning point in practice in a way, in that I was now, I had this role as a Buddhist chaplain, I had practice in my family life, and now I wasn't fighting a work system which seemed quite adharmic in many ways. There was the organisation I was working for was ethical on paper, but I really struggled with some of the ethics of the charity I was working for. When I went to work at Gaia House, it felt like there was something really complete about that, something very congruent, that this wasn't just a Dharma organisation, this wasn't just ethical on paper, people here were really committed to ethics, and I still feel that. I've been working there for 4 years now, and there's something very, very healthy and whole in that for me. And so Ingen mentioned in a talk recently his happiness at living his heart's desires, and I think that's part of what this is for me. This wanting to be wholly devoted to the practice and have all my relations work as an expression of that. That's how I want to be, and I feel like working in a Dharma centre in a prison has been part of what's enabled me to feel wholehearted. Although I still feel like there's a balance between support and supporting, being supported and supporting, and sometimes it feels like I'm overstretching. I'm reaching out. Sometimes it feels like I'm not stretching enough. Usually I err on the side of trying to support others more, and sometimes it feels out of balance. But I'm really supported. There's a wonderful teacher at Guy House who was a nun for 20 or so years in the Theravadan tradition, called Laura, who has been supporting me there. And I'm really deeply appreciating this practice period, particularly the study groups and the little Doanrio practice sessions. There's something about being part of a community training together which I find so nourishing. I mourned the end of the mindfulness master's degree, because that was a kind of training pathway which held me for a long time. But there's still this question as to what's the right thing, what's the important thing, what should I be doing? In many ways, this practice period coming now feels like the monastery is coming to my home. It's like I'm doing the way-seeking mind period, and then the sitting period, and then the children's dinner period, and then the sleep period, and the breakfast period, and the sitting period, and the getting the children ready for school period, and it's kind of structuring my life in the way a monastery structures life, and it's been really wonderful, and I hope this is something that I can help to continue. As the world seems to fall apart around us, as ecological collapse seems imminent, as what the country maybe does or doesn't recover from a COVID pandemic, the economy may collapse. So who knows what's going to happen? I just feel like whatever happens, this practice of peace and love that we share has to be central. Because I think it's this practice that has helped me move from a selfish fear of self-death to something equally profound but much more impersonal, which is an empathy for the pain of the world, something my children have helped me to come into focus. And I'd like to continue to support this practice with you, even though I don't know the way. Maybe all return into the marketplace and be helpful. May our intention in offering and receiving this talk equally extend to every being and place, with the true merit of Buddha's way.